people. I'm Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, speaking today with Dr. Otto Pohl, who has a PhD in history from OAS, I believe it's called.
SOAS.
SOAS, yes, SOAS.
School of Oriental and African Studies.
Yes, and I've spoken with Dr. Pohl in the past as regards things related to Kurdistan, which he has extensive knowledge of in terms of its background, the groups there, and all these sorts of things. And we've stayed in communication. I've seen him also do some appearances on JF Gariapi's channel. And so I'm very happy to be able to speak to him today. The subject of our discussion will be how best to frame this. Europe and Russia, which can, to a considerable extent, particularly since the big periods of Russian expansion, be viewed as a relationship between Europeans and Asians, and particularly, European skills and peoples balanced against the vast territory and resources of Russia, or the Asian continent that is within Russian control, or previously the USSR, or the Russian Empire. And I'd like to dig into this topic with Dr. Pohl because my friend Tim, the interlocutor, whom many of you have seen on this channel, has suggested that the future of Russian territory depends to a considerable extent upon working something out with the Europeans so as to be able to bring in their skills and their bodies into the vast regions of Asia, which have all these resources within that territory, as I said. But before we get into that, please do follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as A Safer Space, the sister channel. Both those channels can be followed on YouTube as well as on BitChute. There's also Minds. There is Gab. I'm on Twitter as well. And for those who wish to support the channel, there's both GoFundMe and Subscribestar. And last but not least, if you want to send me things that are legal and moral, there is a post office box 160006, Atlanta, Georgia 30316. So with that out of the way, Dr. Pohl, before I do my riff, can you tell people where they can find your content? You're on Twitter and YouTube at a minimum, correct?
Yeah, I have probably, if you want to look at my academic work, particularly one article I have called Volk auf dem Weg, a transnational migration of Russian Germans from 1763 to present day. You can find it on my Academia EDU page, which is just under Otto Pohl. And so there's full copies of most of my shorter pieces that were published in peer-reviewed journals are as book chapters.
Excellent. Thank you. And I hope people will check it out. I hope you'll also check out, do you mind if I call you Otto?
Yeah, that's what I go by.
I hope everyone will check out Otto's channel as well. He's been trying to grow it, and that is a difficult thing with all the things going on with YouTube and the algorithms and shadow banning and lack of notifications.
The YouTube channel is under Jonathan Pohl.
Excellent. Okay. Well, please, people do check it out. Okay. So why is this subject interesting to me, and what are the things I hope that you can shed some light on? To frame it as quickly as possible, we've got the back and forth between what we somewhat artificially distinguish as Europe on the one end and Asia on the other, hence, terms like Eurasia. We've got a back and forth going on for quite some time. There are, of course, migrations of Europeans who, we can see from archaeology made it all the way over to the Tarim Basin and Turfan and the rest, with the mummies of Urumqi. You've got the Sogdian Persian trading groups. You've got Jews as far away as Xinjiang, showing that all sorts of ethnic groups have, gone back and forth. You've got Hungarians who have arrived in the West and have been there since about 900 or 1,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. Bulgars who are thought to have come from further east, obviously Turkic groups that have gone back and forth. And most recently, in terms of that sort of thing, we saw the massive movement of the Mongols, who caused all sorts of issues throughout the 13th century. And then, we've seen things like the West moving in their bodies and their skills, attempting to take what let's just call Russian territory for purposes of our discussion, bearing in mind, it might have been the Russian Empire, it might have been the USSR, it might be Russia today. In the past, maybe those states didn't exist, but continuing with the same theme, we've seen Europeans try to move in and take things. You've got Napoleon and his Grande Armée. Obviously, there was the whole business of the German attempted invasions. So there's this back and forth, and we see a consistent pattern. There's just vast territories. My friend Tim puts it in Siberia. You have, vast forests so big that there are places you can go where the trees have never had the sound of an axe echo around them. There's, manganese, there's gold, there's all sorts of minerals. So vast resources and vast territory in Asia and people and skills in Europe. And there's been this back and forth over and over again. And I mentioned things like Sogdians and the rest, or, these different groups of Jews moving as far east as Xinjiang, Hungarians coming this way. But we've also seen European movements. I know that, for example, in the Ukraine, there were Mennonite settlers. I know that if you take a look, as I did, not knowing much about this, I'm sure, Otto, that you know quite a bit about it, which is why I'm so happy to have you here today. I saw maps of German diaspora with the different settlements that they had made within Russian territory. And they go much further east than I had ever imagined. And these are, in many cases, large, significant settlements. And so the Germans in particular seem to be a good test case for considering how this business of this tension that I have described can play out. Again, there's resources and territory, just endless amounts of it in what we're calling Russia. And there are, people and skills in Europe that the Russians don't have, or at least didn't have, arguably, during different periods. And so you see a willingness on the part of the Russians to bring in European groups to a certain extent. And it always seems to have a tension inherent in it. So you just look at the court, right? For example, where they spoke French and they have this long-standing relationship with France. You have people like Voltaire being entertained by, it was Catherine the Great, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Catherine the Second.
And so but by the same token, you have huge amounts of German blood that has gone into the Russian nobility. So, you see a lot of German last names with some of the noble Russian houses. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
I was going to mention almost all of the Germans that were in the nobility, or also the Tsarist officer corps, come from the Baltic Germans. So these are people from Latvia and Estonia that came during the time when the Sword brothers had been merged into the Teutonic Knights, and then they established with the bishopric of Riga basically themselves as the ruling noble class over the Estonian and Latvian peasants. But they had their own special privileges that were retained even after the Tsarist annexation under Peter the Great of that territory from the Swedish who had ruled it. But those are a very different category of people than what we refer to as the German colonists, which is the majority of the German population coming in from Catherine the Great up until about the unification of Germany. So there's about a 100-year period between 1763 and 1871 where you have a large-scale German colonization. But those people are, for the most part, farmers, some in industry. But for the specifically nobles and military, they're almost all this elite class from what is now Latvia and Estonia, the Baltic Germans.
Indeed, and it's a strange thing to say German, for the periods of history that we're talking about, because this predates Bismarck, and what's a German at that point, given all these differences.
It's defined really somebody who speaks a dialect of German, and in some cases that dialect of German wasn't very German. In some cases it would be defined as closer to Dutch for many of the Mennonites, Plattdeutsch speakers. And in fact, during World War One, they attempted to pass themselves off as being Dutch rather than German because Holland was neutral during the war. And of course, the Stolypin, I believe it was, his ancestry was a Baltic German, but he claimed it was Dutch because it was politically more correct by that time.
Right on. And I had imagined that some of this may well go back to the Teutonic Knights, and you see that in terms of Estonia and the rest. You see lots of German names still in that area. I'm probably mixing up the specific countries because I don't know a great deal about Latvia
No,
versus
Estonia
Lithuania.
had a large German population up until the evacuations were in 1940. So the 75,000 or so Germans from Latvia and Estonia were evacuated out into the Vartagau and what is now Poland, but a lot of them managed to make it further west.
Right on. Well, let me just lay out this last piece then, because it seems like you're well primed to just spring into this, having done all the background research over quite some time. And as you pointed out, having published on it. The reason I'm after this is because, as my friend Tim has laid it out, it seems as though something has to be sorted here in terms of the skills, the know-how, and the population of Europe, which if you take a look at a population density map, you'll see that Europe is very densely populated. They don't have anything like the big open spaces that we do even in the United States, to say nothing of what they have going on in Europe. So there's, increasing, burgeoning population pressure in Europe. And of course, people like the Swiss or the Dutch or, all the Germanic groups, they tend to be able to make the trains run on time. They tend to be concerned about how things are manufactured. They're advanced civilizations with considerable, industrial capacity and research and development, innovation, design, all this sort of thing. And in Russia, what you have is a population that was dragged kicking and screaming, again, to use some terms favored by my friend Tim, into modernity through the projects of a figure like Stalin, and previously other, going back to, Catherine the Great. Think of things like,
Probably, I mean, the usual paradigm is the three service revolutions. So Ivan the Fourth was Ivan the Terrible, and then Peter the Great, and then Stalin as a way of modernizing, I guess, Russia, for lack of a better term, into a modern, bureaucratic, centralized state.
A much better way of explaining how long this has been an issue, and they've been attempting to deal with it. And yet it seems that when they bring populations in, they have real issues with it. They have issues with resentment. They have issues with, for example, isolated groups operating in ways that create problems in terms of the local populations and how they view them. Again, that goes under the rubric of resentment. And there are also, huge issues involved, at least up until recently, with the vast spaces that we're talking about, the vast distances that it's hard for a lot of us to get our heads around, because it's just a massive territory. And doubtless there are many other issues that they've faced, which is what I hope to hear more about from you. But the main drive here, just to kind of put the cherry on top of all of this, is that it seems that Russia needs to do something with that vast space. It's like a vacuum. So if you go look over in the far eastern parts of Russia, they've had to deal with all sorts of problems in the past. I mean, you had in, 1905, Japanese invasion, and things did not, was it 1905? Wasn't it the Russo-Japanese War?
It was before that. 1904 was the attack. And 1905 was the year the war ends. But as soon as the war ends, there's a revolution.
Right, the revolution.
That almost throws Tsar Nicholas II out of power. And of course, it's a dry run for the actual throwing him out of power in 1917.
Indeed. And I've also understood that there are real issues with Chinese populations being pushed more or less covertly over the border into Russian regions in the Far East, at least historically. Now, I bring these things up simply because they tend to point to the way in which this massive territory with all its resources uh, and underscoring the dwindling population of the Russians. You know, they're
Well, it's not dwindling anymore. It's kind of stabilized now.
as of quite recently, though.
Yes.
Right. And stabilized is, it's still a touch and go thing. Yeah. Again, this is why I wanted to talk to you because you know much
Right,
more
but
about it.
I remember people talking about that the uh, attrition, that is, death over births, being so high, combined with massive emigration out, that they were worried that there would be a complete demographic collapse, and nobody talks about that anymore. Now it's uh, as I said, it's stable. It's not they're not increasing it massively, but the danger, for instance, that you won't have a Russian state because of a lack of population is no longer there.
Excellent. And see, this is where I learn things. But the point I wanted to underscore there is when you have a huge vacuum and you're surrounded by people with large populations who want that, territory and resources naturally, then that creates certain issues. Now, I'm not saying that the Russians cannot at present defend their borders. Certainly, they appear to be able to. So all I want to underscore is that it seems for Russia to really take off further as a global power, they're going to need to bring in highly skilled populations, and a natural place to look to do that, given the various options available. Do they want to bring over millions of Chinese? I would doubt it. But perhaps they could bring over a certain number of Europeans in order to help them build skills, build infrastructure, these kinds of things. And I have seen, for example, the development of certain focused cities. So I think out in Vladivostok, there's a whole cosmodrome city that has been, or not Vladivostok, but in the Far East.
Well, Baikonur is in Kazakhstan, where they built the rocket.
Right, but there's a new one that has been
I
built
don't know
much
about that.
more.
There was a in Siberia under Khrushchev. They built the academic Gorosk, academic city. I think might have been the most recent large scale type of build a city out of nowhere internal colonization. But it happened a lot in the Stalin era. The most famous one is Magnitogorsk, which is a big Uralic metallurgy uh, combine. There's a book written by Stephen Kotkin about it called Magnetic Mountain, which is a literal translation from the Russian into English of the place name. But other places, particularly in the Arctic, where you had the development of basically prison camps, labor camps into company towns, and now much less populated than they were under the Soviet era. But Vorkuta, which was a very prominent coal mining town, particularly in the post-Stalin era for coking coal. Norilsk, the nickel, and then of course Kolyma, particularly around Magadan, gold mining.
Right. And this just brings up another issue, which is that, we think of the frontier as being developed by these, pioneering types who've heard the call, go west, young man, and they head out in their Conestoga wagons and they find this bright future, whereas much of the go east process is either pushed militarily, for example, with like the Orenburg Cossacks, right, moving in and taking Khiva and Samarkand and the rest, or it is pushed through a model that I guess in some sense you could compare with the colonization of Australia with penal colonies, in terms of sending out groups of prisoners to do things in Siberia, where these populations were not pushing so much in quite the same way. But all of this, and I don't doubt there are probably some things I have wrong there. I don't want to talk the whole time. I want to turn it over to you, but I really want to underscore this business of their need for people. I want to learn more about that. I want to learn more from you about why people who move there have problems, what sort of issues they have with the local populations, whether or not friction is created in the rest, resentments, why there seems to have been about faces with government policies in terms of letting them in versus pushing them out. Obviously you get lots going on with Stalin, with Chechens being sent far away and the rest, but
I got three meta issues here I'll cover. One, I think perhaps the Chinese issue. And that's been an issue for the Russians since the 19th century. But it's never really played out to be as great a threat as perceived. At most, even at the high levels of supposedly non-counted illegal immigrants, we're talking maybe 500,000 Chinese at the height. In terms of people actually registered in census, it's never been more than about 50, 60,000. And part of the reason is because China's so close. They just send people there temporarily, single men, as traders that do their shuttle trade back and forth. So unlike some other groups that colonize permanently with families, and in the East Asian case, the main group would be Koreans, the Chinese never really had a large permanent population. And there's always been this thought that it would, and there was a massive expulsion in 37, 38 of about 30,000 of them, and then the remaining 20,000, about 10,000 were shot and 10,000 relocated into Kazakhstan. But it's never turned out that the Chinese were able to get permanent colonies in the Far East, for instance, the way the Koreans did. The other thing I want to talk about is the German colonization from the 1764, when the Norka is founded in the Volga, up until they keep bringing people in until the 1870s. But this is all top down. This is done because the Russian government is deliberately facilitating it. So in this sense, it's very similar to earlier invitations to German colonists by the Kingdom of Poland, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Hungary, right? And in the cases of those where you had settlements as early as King Geza II in Hungary, inviting Germans from Saxony into Transylvania against the bulwark against the Cumans. This is a later manifestation of it. In this case, it's not the Cumans, but it's the Kazakhs and the Kalmucks over by the Caspian Sea that are a problem. One of the reasons why they want German settlement. But Catherine II herself is German, so this is why I think there is this deliberate spreading of the manifesto of 22nd July 1763 throughout the German land. In German. So, and there's a lot of pull factors, which the Russian government isn't giving today. Freedom from conscription, freedom of religion, as long as you're a Christian. So most of the settlers were Lutheran, about 20% Catholic, and then 5% Mennonite, and then there were some smaller Protestant sects. They were given freedom of communal self-rule and freedom of taxes for, I think it was 30 years. And then the freedom from conscription was supposed to be forever, but it was rescinded in 1874 by the Tsarist government, and is one of the reasons why there's large-scale emigration to Canada, the U.S., and Argentina after that period of time. So there's this pull factor. The other thing is there's a push factor. The Volga German colonies, the original ones from 1764 onward to, it's not that long a period of time, about 10 years or so, that they settled about 30,000 initially. This is right after the 7-Year War, which is known as the French and Indian War in the U.S., but it devastates Europe because Prussia is fighting against France and its allies. So many of the people from German states between Prussia and France end up in a very bad situation. And when you have the renewal of the manifesto to open it up to new Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea by her grandson, Alexander II, in 1804, this is during the Napoleonic Wars. He also opens up Bessarabia, which they take from Wallachia, in 1812 to settlement. Right? So there's this push factors that existed in Europe at the time of all of the mass migrations. You see the mass migrations into Congress Poland, the part of Poland that Russia takes after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, also because of the Napoleonic Wars. And then there's these pull factors, the Russian government giving deliberate privileges to the colonists that most of the Russian population do not have. Most of the Russian population, as well as, and speaking as the empire as a whole, because they impose the system on Ukraine when they take it from uh, the Polish rulers, the system of serfdom. These are free farmers that are coming in as colonists into the Volga and Black Sea regions from Central Europe. And the third thing I wanted to point about briefly, you can get back to this, any of these points once I finish this. Migration has, in addition to push and pull factors, basically structural factors. That is, people will migrate from one area to another based upon having common connections. And it's usually a colonial situation where they know the language, they know the legal system, and familiar with it from being ruled by the metropolitan. So in this case, almost all of the migration coming into the Russian Federation are people from former Soviet states like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and recently there's been a lot coming in from Ukraine. And the reason is these people speak Russian and they're familiar with the Soviet basis kind of current Russian culture and the Soviet basis of current Russian law and ways to do things. So it's very similar to people from former British colonies like Ghana going to the UK, or former French colonies like Algeria going to France.
Right on. And can you, this is all very helpful. Thank you. Can you perhaps maybe tease out, it seems implicit in what you said, for example, that you've got the local populations, many of whom are functioning as serfs, historically, and then you have these people brought in as free farmers. I can certainly see elements there that could, lead to resentment and the rest. But can you perhaps give us a quick overview, perhaps across some of this historical period, starting in the 18th century and then at present? What are some of the things that you tend to see in terms of the Russian population, both historically and today, that cause them to not be so pleased about the idea of immigration?
All right. For all of the German settlements to the east, they have basically the three generations of kind of rule. The first, Tod, death. The second, Not, need. And the third, Brot, bread. So it takes a while to become wealthy. So the first years are very hard. They are raided and attacked by the local Kazakhs. One of the reasons Catherine the Great wanted to put them there, because they couldn't get the people, the Slavs, to stay there. They would just run away. They figured it's better to take my chance of being caught as an escaped serf than to be raped and tortured and killed by the steppe nomads.
Or, carried off by the Turkmen into slavery, yeah.
Well, these were Kazakhs. I'm not sure if they would have been sold down further south or not. Usually the story that the men were killed and the women were raped and everything was plundered. They weren't necessarily as well organized as the Crimean Khanate or the Emirate of Bukhara or the Khanate of Khiva, where you have organized slave trades. But once they got settled, they became very prosperous and wealthy, in part because one of the reasons Catherine the Great wanted to have them was to be a model to the local Russian and Ukrainians. Later, her grandson, in particular, Alexander II, opening up New Russia to European settlers. But that never really worked well. And what we see is that, particularly in the Black Sea region, Ukraine, particularly among the Mennonites, who get a special charter by Paul I, who was the son of Catherine the Great in 1800, that they become very, very wealthy. And they become large landowners. And so much so they end up with problems trying to acquire new land because the population is growing. So you end up with, they have a system of land tenure among the Germans in the Black Sea region, is that the land is entailed and usually inherited by the youngest son. So he inherits everything, and it can't be divided anyway. So then they've got to use cash from the sale of commodities, usually wheat, But in the Volga, they also grew a lot of tobacco uh, to purchase land in Ukraine to settle the sons on. And eventually that ran out. And so that's where you see in 1882, they go all the way to the Talas Valley in what is today Kyrgyzstan to establish a settlement. And that's one of the first eastern settlements from 1882 on. You see the settlement. The Volga is different because in the Volga they adopt the Russian land tenure system of the Mir, where there's communal ownership of land that is repatriated by the in Russian it's Starita. I guess it would be in German Scholze, the elders of the village, periodically on the basis of how many workers each family has. And so they didn't have the land pressure so much because they could always redivide the land every so often that the much more wealthier Black Sea Germans did. But they also did suffer a massive famine in the late 19th century that also spurred people moving eastward into Kazakhstan and various parts of Siberia. So that's where you start in the late 19th century to see these, they call them daughter colonies, coming out into the non-European areas of the Russian Empire, including as far south is Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. So we even had these settlements in Central Asia, although most of the settlement in Central Asia was in what is today Kazakhstan, and to a lesser extent some areas in Kyrgyzstan.
If I may jump in, two things. One is some of the massive resentment on the part of the rural underclass towards kulaks related to a sense of outsiders buying up all the land and taking away opportunities associated with the Mennonites. Because I looked at, for example, the figure of Makhno, yeah, and the relationship there with Batko, and the Mennonites. It seemed like there was a major resentment.
The men went on a major slaughter spree in 1919 against a number of Mennonite colonies, which was so great. For the first time ever in their history, they formed armed self-defense detachments.
But would this relate in addition to that, does this carry all the way up to the Holodomor and the treatment of the kulaks?
Well, let me get to that. Yeah. You see during collectivization, and particularly dekulakization, the removal of kulak, in the Ukraine, the Soviet OGPU basically, in their rhetoric, begins to classify people who are either ethnically German or ethnically Polish as being kulaks by definition. Right, so there is already this disproportionate targeting of ethnic Germans and Poles in 1930 and 1931 in Ukraine for deportation as special settlers to the Arctic Circle and Urals in order to confiscate their land. And this is, I think, the beginning here of any official record, because this appears in the archives, of a movement away from purely class-based categories to ethno-racial ones in terms of targeting enemies. And you see this again big time in 37 and 38 during the Great Terror, where there are specific national operations. So there is a German operation. It's the second largest after the Polish operation. Some 55,000 people are arrested under the German operation, and most of those, about 80% or so, are shot, and the rest sent to labor camps. So they do have this movement. But I think it's not just economics. I think that a lot of it has to do with the idea of outsiders being ideological enemies. Particularly, you see when they cut off immigration right after Germany becomes unified in 1871. When do they revoke the privileges? same year, 1871, they announced that it would be revoked and they'll be gone by 1881. 1874, immunity from conscription is removed from all of the German colonists.
So it would seem to be related in some way to the spread of nationalism further east and the way in which these populations, now that Germany's coming together, you can't think of it as these little independent elements. It would seem that they envisioned some risk there in terms of having a fifth column within their territory or something.
Right. Well, the fifth column is kind of anachronistic because Spanish
right,
Civil War hasn't occurred, but it does come up in the terror in 37 and 38 because the Spanish Civil War is in its tail end at that point, and so you've already had Franco march upon Madrid with 4 columns, the fifth one awaiting him. But Trojan horse is kind of, I think, the way they perceived of the German colonies after 1871, where you start to see revocation of the privileges and Russification. They start making, they had all these church-based schools in the German colonies that taught all of the subjects initially in German, and then they were required all of a sudden in the 19th century, starting in 1897, no, late 19th century, to teach everything in Russian instead. So there was this attempt to forcibly Russify the educational system. And of course, with conscription, you now have also a forcible Russification of the adult male population in terms of trying to at least make everybody bilingual, if not try and move towards Russian as a lingua franca for the population.
And I have a quick question that I wanted to tap on earlier. Just in the case of Uzbekistan, as I recall, it's a major cotton producing area, and particularly high quality cotton. And I do recall that right after the war between the states and in the U.S., there was an issue with all that cotton production going offline because of Reconstruction and issues with workforces, and it just being following directly on the heels of a war. So cotton had to come from other places, and I do recall it was rather interesting that freeing the slaves was a justification for the North moving down into the South in the United States. And very shortly thereafter, I think Russia annex Uzbekistan?
Well, it wasn't
right
actually
after?
annexed. Annexed part of it in 1865.
Right.
General Kaufmann, who was a Baltic German, arrived in Tashkent and then sent a telegraph informing St. Petersburg that he had taken it. And they were not aware of this beforehand, that there was a move to take it. But most of what is Uzbekistan and parts of Tajikistan were put under protectorate. So Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva, unlike the Khanate of Kokand, which is where Tashkent was, were not directly annexed. They were made protectorates within the Russian Empire, and the Bukharan Emir and Khivan Khan were allowed to have a great deal of internal autonomy.
Right. You can see even in the Prokudin-Gorsky photographs, you can still see the Emir of Bukhara sitting there, with his honor belt and all the rest. But the thing I was getting at there is that it seems that Russia moved in to take that area, whether it was, driven by, maybe it's a happy accident that officer went down and took it. But in 1865, that's particularly when cotton wasn't available. Of course, we remember the expression "cotton is king," and Uzbekistan is a major cotton growing area, and one of the justifications provided for moving Russia into Uzbekistan was to free all the Christian slaves who had been taken. So we can see how a narrative that exists in the U.S. to justify moving in for these economic reasons apparently was applied there as well.
There weren't a lot of Christian slaves. There were some. It turns out most of the slaves were Persians. The Turkmen had decided that the Shiites weren't real Muslims, and therefore it was okay to kidnap them and sell them to they weren't Uzbek then, but the Emir of Bukhara and the Khan of Khiva.
Yeah, and in any case, I was only referring to it as a pretext. It's much like after major terrorist attacks of 9/11, suddenly all around the world, everyone's using terrorism as an excuse to do whatever it is.
But certainly the cotton thing is correct. After it came under Russian rule, it becomes a major source of cotton for production of Russian textiles, particularly places like Ivanova, and this becomes a huge in the Soviet period. The Soviet Union was completely self-sufficient in textiles all the way up from the growing of cotton in Central Asia to the final production in Russia. But what it meant was, of course, was that all of the agricultural resources pretty much in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, particularly for irrigation, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, etc., being diverted for production of cotton, so they were no longer self-sufficient in food. They had to import food from other regions of the Soviet Union. And so you have kind of pointed out a colonial economic situation developed despite the Soviets' claim to equality. They're producing raw materials in the Asian areas that have low value, and then value-added products are being produced in the European areas and sent back to be sold, right, for more low-value resources, right? So this is very similar to growing cotton in places like Africa,
right, Egypt,
Egypt or northern India for the British during their colonial days.
But to bring it back around to what I'm sorry for going off on the tangent, but it's great to talk to somebody who not only will correct fifth column metaphors to be more appropriate with the Trojan horse, but also knows the subject so well. What I had originally wanted to get at was who actually ended up farming that cotton in Uzbekistan once it was taken. Who were the first people brought in to do so?
Well, most of the farming was always done by Uzbeks. There were never a lot of Germans brought in to farm cotton in Uzbekistan. There were a lot brought into Tajikistan, and they're kind of a strange case. They were Germans from Western Ukraine that had avoided forcible resettlement in 1941 into Kazakhstan and Siberia by coming under protection of the Wehrmacht. And they were evacuated into Germany, and of the 300,000 or so Germans from the former Soviet Union, about 200,000 were forcibly repatriated with the full support of the U.S. and Great Britain. And those that were considered able-bodied, did not have large families of lots of small children, were sent to places like the far north or the far east or northern Kazakhstan. But those that weren't, and we're talking about 20,000 people that were deemed to not be able to do that type of hard physical labor, were sent to Tajikistan to work on cotton farms, which was viewed as being, as hard as it was viewed as being a less onerous form of labor that would that they could complete without dying in such a short period as to make it not worthwhile for the Soviets.
Right, reading their actuarial tables or whatever the equivalent is. Okay, so I guess the main thread that we were on was this idea of the types of resentment across this period of history, right. Why the people tended to dislike them all the way up to the present, if in fact that's the case.
Well, I mean, it depends who you're talking to. There was resentment among some of the agricultural workers in Ukraine for the richer farmers, particularly Mennonites. And so you get people like Makhno. That comes from the Tsarist period. We do see this idea that they were not people who could be assimilated into the Soviet system for a couple of reasons. One, because they had origins outside of the Russian Empire. So there was always this idea that because they had immigrated from what becomes Germany, that they were politically loyal to that state because that's where their ethnogenesis was. So, we can look very closely. The first German colonist, as far as the the colonial population, the majority, is only established in 1764. So we have clear record of the origin. This is not something shaded in the the students always, they put the worst possible entry to their essay in the early mist of time before anything was recorded. So there's that, and then finally, these people were not. They were all of them isolated in these colonies, and the colonies even isolated from each other by religion. So the Lutheran colony didn't mix with Catholic or Mennonite colonies. So of course they were also isolated from the Slavic and other non-German populations through all this time. And what this means is that they're viewed as being, even into the Soviet period, as colonists coming in, foreign and alien. And they also having their own ways. Because particularly of the religious importance of religion to their individual life, there's a lot of resistance. And we see consistently resistance to collectivization, resistance to atheist campaigns, resistance to various other Soviet campaigns. The Mennonites in particular, they already in the 1920s organized, which they get Soviet approval for, but they organized their own large cooperative movements to kind of recreate their own economic autonomy away from the Soviet state. So this is done in the 20s, and then when they start to fall apart, they start to organize emigration movements out of the Soviet Union to leave and go elsewhere. Many of them going to Canada, and some going to Paraguay.
And so you kind of see a situation where the argument could be made, it seems reasonably, that, hey, these people never intended to stay in the first place. This was a target of opportunity. They left when it got rough. They'll never truly be Russians. And I also wonder, is some of this being driven, as it seems you're hinting, simply by the same sorts of things that that are reflected in the division between the Eastern and Western Church? These are Christians from a different domain. They are not Christians of the East.
Right. Well, the only Germans that became Pravoslav or Orthodox were those that were Baltic Germans that joined the Russian officer corps or the nobility, and they were required to convert from Lutheranism to Pravoslav Orthodoxy.
So the religious might be an aspect of it.
But the German colonists, right, they were promised under both manifestos, 1763 and 1804, they would have complete freedom of religion as long as they were Christian. So the manifestos did not apply to non-Christians. So they weren't seeking to have Jews immigrate. There was a definite line on that by Empress Catherine II and her descendants. But as far as Lutherans, Catholics, Mennonites, Lutheran separatists, Baptists, all kinds of Christian denominations from the Germans that were allowed to come in and have their own settlements. Each settlement was basically centered around its own distinct church. And in 1832, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Russia is founded in what is now Estonia, in the city of Tartu, which is now Dorpat. But the seminary became the university there, very nice university. And in 1848, they established a bishopric for Catholics in Tiraspol, in Saratov, in the Volga region. So they did have even there this connections back to Europe in terms of Western religious practices.
And what do you? We've got about roughly 10 minutes, 9 minutes left, where we can sort of talk about how historically the Russians have resisted and resented and disliked this. I hope that we can identify some basic themes, because then I'd like to come over, after about 10 minutes and take a look at the present and what the looking back into history might allow us to extrapolate as regards the current situation, what they might do in the future, what their plans might be. But I still want to get at maybe a meta picture of.
I got a basic one. Where things flare up, it comes again from the top down. In Russia, things tend to come from the top down. So just as they were brought in from the top down by Catherine II, who herself came from Germany, the repression is also from the top down. And where you see it is in reaction and response to what is happening between the relations between Germany and Russia. So the first, as I said, when Germany unifies in 1871, it is now seen as a threat, whereas before there was all the, Prussia was not considered to be nearly as powerful before it took over the remaining German states after 1871 and defeats France, one of the most probably the most powerful state militarily after Germany on the continent itself. So so France is defeated badly in 1871. The Russians are like, oh my God, there's like a new boy on the block, and he's got his people in our empire. The second time we really see this flare up is World War I, where you see there's a pogrom in Moscow, kills 3 people but destroys lots of property in May of 1915. And there is, 26th to 29th of May 1915, and there's the liquidation laws. And so all the Germans 150 kilometers from the border, the front line, are to be deprived of their property and long-term leases and forcibly removed eastward into Siberia and the Volga. And so the Volhynian Germans, who came from mostly Congress Poland into northwest Ukraine, including my great-grandmother's family, about 200,000 of them loaded onto trains by the Russian military and forcibly relocated eastward.
How interesting that they weren't, though, pushed out. That labor force and that ability, they're like, we're not turning loose of that. Let's just move them away from the border.
Yeah, well, the Soviets internally moved people rather than expel people. The only expulsions I've seen were the 30,000 or so Chinese. They were expelled, but everybody else is moved somewhere else in the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And then there is a decree in December 1916, I believe, to deport all the Volga Germans into Siberia. But the February 1917 revolution, putting the provisional government in power, they nullify that act before it can be implemented. And so it's not until the Second World War in 1941 where you have the mass deportation of the Volga Germans into Siberia and northern Kazakhstan. But certainly, where you flare up of repression, things like mass forced relocation and confiscation of property, it happens when there is conflict with Germany. And of course, the nadir of the history of the Russian Germans is during the Second World War, when they are all forcibly rounded up and deported into Siberia and Kazakhstan and then mobilized for forced labor, particularly in the Urals, where they are in what's called the labor army, which basically they are conscripted to go work in labor camps without any criminal trials or charges or even sentences. So, and the decrees say until the end of the war. And for some of them, that was 1957, but most were released in 1948.
Well, then I wonder. This is just a quick question. I have to ask, since I've got you here and you're so knowledgeable about this. There's a lot of talk about how the famine and all the deaths in the Ukraine of the Holodomor was driven by a kind of Jewish hatred on the part of the communist leadership for Christians and the rest. I hear a lot about that. And I kind of wonder, given that we can see a long-standing resentment on the part of...
I just did a show the other week on the Holodomor, but I'll go over it again.
Well, no. This is just a very quick thing that I just want to ask about. The case could certainly be made, it would seem, from what you're saying, that much of that anger towards the kulaks and their subsequent destruction and the famine that ensued could be, at least in large part, explained by a resentment upon the part of the rural lower classes towards those landowners, which doesn't have any really.
Well, if you're talking about dekulakization, some, although many people deported as kulaks were called kulak henchmen because they actually had no property. They just were ideologically opposed to collectivization. But for the famine itself, I mean, the vast majority of victims numerically were Ukrainian farmers that were descendant of people who had been basically they were middle peasants. They were not the poor peasants. Well, I mean, there were a lot of poor peasants starved to death too. But for the collectivization, there's some argument to be made that there's resentment from the poorer peasants. But the famine itself was pretty much everybody that was rural population in the territory of Ukraine. So that has ethnic imbalance, and that particularly the Russian minority and also the Jewish minority are largely urban, whereas the Ukrainians and Germans are all rural. But I don't see there being so much it being class-based as in that sense. The class war was over already by 31 when the kulaks had already been removed from the countryside.
Well, fair enough. And I am dragging you off to one side when you have so much material already to cover. So I'll leave you be on that. But can you just tell people where they can find that clip on the Holodomor?
Yeah, I think it was I don't know if it was the week before last week, but if you go to my YouTube channel, Jonathan Pohl, it'll be in the last month. I have one Say Hello to More. The last one I did says Sword and Sorcery from Howard to Wagner and beyond. So that one has nothing to do with the famine in Ukraine.
Right. Okay. Well, then I'm sorry to have interrupted you there. We've still got a couple minutes left on this theme of the resentments, and then maybe we can jump to the present.
But just the reason I think the Jewish element comes up in the Holodomor is because the two of the highest guys, as well as a lot of other people in high ranks, were Jewish by nationality. So Kaganovich, who was sent down by Stalin since he was from Ukraine geographically, to direct the extraction of grain, which led to the famine in 32, 33, and the head of he was actually number 2 man, but the number 1 man was too sick to do anything. So Yagoda, who was also Jewish by nationality, was head of the political police, which was in charge of going house to house and searching for grain and stripping it. So you have at the very top, at least, where we can identify, and it probably goes down in terms of the OGPU, as probably a fairly large disproportionate representation as well in the lower ranks, but I've only seen it for the higher rank because you have to break it down. And so I think that's where a lot of that comes from. Certainly, some of the Nazi advisors were refugees from the Soviet Union that were ethnic Germans. Karl Stump and Georg. Oh, I can't remember his name, but there were a number, and of course Alfred Rosenberg was a Baltic German from Estonia. So there were Eastern Germans. There was a organization called Bruder in Not, Brother in Need, which was to try and raise famine relief during the Holodomor for ethnic Germans in Ukraine. And it's one of the famous things that one of its most famous contributor was President Hindenburg.
And so how would you summarize, thank you, how would you summarize, just as it's great that you mentioned the thing about generally it's top down, right? Generally, they're brought in from the top down. Generally, they're sent out from the top down. It's a great way to, I think, just generally to understand what happens in Russia. And it's great that you have linked it to these, sort of to the macro picture in terms of the geopolitics and the affairs of the day. That's helpful. Is there some similar way that you could characterize in fairly short order what, leaving aside the centralized issues that you talked about, other than that, how would you characterize the general way in which there is a bottom-up grassroots resistance? And again, bearing in mind, and I totally understand why with so vast an area, you've told me, Oliver, look, there are different cases, different places, different issues. It varies widely. But to whatever extent it's possible to wrap this sort of section.
You're talking about German resistance to Soviet policies?
No. I'm talking about Russian grassroots resistance to the introduction of these foreign populations.
I will tell you that the most blatant one, and then we can go back, but the most blatant one took place after the Soviet Union had already collapsed. And there was kind of a last attempt. They wanted to get the Volga German Republic restored. It had been, the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Social Republic had been dissolved during the deportation. Specifically on 7th of September, which was 4 days after they started moving people out by train.
And what year was that?
1941. There had been attempts to restore it earlier and had failed, but now with the Soviet Union collapse, they thought there was one last attempt.
So this is now the 90s?
Yeah. There were massive demonstrations by Russians. And said that they would, and the signs they held said they'd rather have AIDS than the restoration of the German colony. And this was from the bottom up, but it got co-opted because the most famous demonstrator eventually became President Yeltsin himself, protesting against the idea of restoring a Volga German ASSR. But this had kind of had earlier incarnation in Kazakhstan. There was in order to try and take pressure off from West Germany, and also to try and further placate the emigration movement by Germans, saying, well, if we can't have our own republic and our national rights in the Soviet Union, then let us go back to Germany where we can have national rights. And so the idea was they would create a German autonomous oblast in Kazakhstan. But the Kazakh communists did not like this idea of carving up their homeland to give to somebody else. And so Kuneyev in the Politburo, very, very clever and wily Kazakh, he knew he couldn't oppose Brezhnev on this. That would be a way to get removed from the Politburo and sent to a dacha like Khrushchev did. So he informed the university professors, and they had their students come out in big, massive anti-German demonstrations in Kazakhstan, and this put an end to plans to create a German autonomous oblast. But you can see a co-option from the bottom and the top here. Sometimes they're able to rally this bottom up. And of course, during the deportation, the NKVD, they sent all kinds of rumors out that the Germans were, criminals, and sometimes the demons have one eye in the center of their head and horns. Very crazy stuff, but sometimes primitive people living out in the cohorts might believe it in extraordinary circumstances. So there was this kind of propaganda aimed at the masses to entice hostility during that time.
So generally, am I to understand that the motivations of the people, the commoners, if you will, or just the everyday folks in these regions, it's really just a concern that a bunch of foreigners are going to come in and own what's really theirs? Is there I've tried to tease out like a difference between Eastern and Western.
Sort of, because it's not like the idea, the way ethno-racial thought works in the Soviet Union is the idea that each group, ethno-social organism, as Julian Bromley would talk about, has its own soil and land and territory, right? So you can't take that away, if you alienate part of that, if you give autonomy within that to a group that is foreign to it, right? Then that's a taking away of the uh, let's say wealth, collective wealth of the nation that it rightfully belongs to. Right, so it's almost like it's not just that they're owning it. It'd be like alien occupation and colonization.
But now, presumably, you don't have these issues for the regions that are, to a large extent, unpopulated to start with. So, for example, in the Arctic or in other areas of Siberia.
No, and there are two German districts that have autonomy currently in Siberia, Halbstadt in Altai, and Asovo in, I believe, Omsk.
Okay, well then we have about 23 minutes left to aim for about an hour and a half on this. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is going on today against this kind of background that we painted? Because, for instance, you take a look at how there was there were a number of headlines about Putin having given a certain amount of land and some incentives to a number of boer farmers from South Africa. I think that was somewhere in the neighborhood. Was it like Krasnodar Krai, I want to say. It's basically near Adygea, over there, just north of the Black Sea, but just a little bit.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Near Pohl.
Right. And so what you're seeing there is essentially, Boer, who we've already talked about, Dutch sort of being loosely considered with the Germans. Of course, once they've come by way of South Africa, you've got French, you've got English, and it's a different animal. But to a large extent, it seems as though it reflects historically some things that were done in the past. And so I just use that as a conversation starter. So if you can maybe address that, but then let's look at the bigger picture of what Putin might be doing as regarding bringing in other populations, if anything, and how and why.
Okay. Well, in South Africa, obviously, the Afrikaners are facing a lot of push factors which don't exist for people in European Union countries, for the vast majority of them. So, as I said, when you had these massive migrations, there were these massive push factors, the 7-Year War, the Napoleonic War, basically people trying to escape devastation of war and high tax and conscription and whatnot. So that's, I think, a major reason why Europe is unlikely in the near future to be sending a lot of immigrants out anywhere, but certainly not to Russia, which is relatively quite poor to them.
But now we have seen. We have seen a large number of Germans, not a large number, but a noticeable number of Germans going to places like Poland and Hungary, have we not?
Yeah, which are European Union countries, and they're quite wealthy compared to Russia. And they're also, so I don't think it's really the same. As I said, most of the migration coming into the Russian Federation is coming from former Soviet states, particularly Central Asia and the Caucasus, especially Azerbaijan. But now, because of its problems, you're getting a lot of people coming in from Ukraine as well. Now, not all of those people coming from Central Asia are Asian. There's been a lot of Russians that have returned. There's been a number of ethnic Germans that have moved from Kazakhstan to the Russian Federation. So if you look at the numbers, right, the ethnic German population in Kazakhstan went down from 1 million in 1989 to about 180,000 today. Right, it went down from about 900,000 to about 400,000 in Russia. So much less extreme emigration out of Russia than out of Kazakhstan. If you look at the other areas of Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, it went down from over 100,000 to less than 10,000. Tajikistan, it went down to basically nothing, from I think around 40, 45,000.
Okay, so one thing I'm hearing from you is that yeah, there's a big push factor with the South Africans. Many of them, are in a situation where they should just be happy to take an alternative given the dire straits that they face at home. Okay, clear, good point. As regards, the business of Germans and perhaps other Europeans moving further east, your point is well taken. It's a good one. I realize, Hungary is still in the EU, so the systems are in place for them, for example, to be able to transfer, their money and the rest. They don't have to worry in most cases about, converting currency and the rest. So Russia, from what I'm hearing from you, is still at present because of real issues with the rule of law. Whether or not your contract is going to be honored, whether or not you're going to have to deal with the mafia, depending on where you are. All these sorts of questions and how the locals might treat you. The fact that many of these
Well, I
Europeans.
think it's just the big thing is just wages are so much lower.
Okay, so the big issue being how much money you can make. So right now we're seeing a situation where we do have push factors in Europe, considerable ones. I mean, they're just only now beginning to manifest, but particularly in Western Europe, it first manifests it's like flight from, big cities like Paris or London, right? And then people, begin to say, oh, there's this guy, Survival Russia or whatever. I think he's a Dane who moved to some northern region of Russia because he was able to buy big plots of land with his family and get out in the woods. It's still very much like an early phase kind of thing. You don't see a lot of it. But I wonder what sorts of things Putin has done or can do or might do in future to make his country a more attractive target for this kind of immigration, is, if at all. What is your sense of where they might go with this? Because again, they've got vast amounts of territory, and what they don't have is highly skilled populations ready to do things like create beautiful infrastructure, trains that run on time.
Yeah, but I don't see the current Russian government uh, emulating Catherine II because Putin is very much in the minds of kind of this Slavophile Russia having a different path, Eurasianist mindset that Russia is not the same as Central Europe, whereas Catherine II was from Germany itself, one of the German states, and was looking, as it were, to follow in the footsteps of Peter the Great and kind of emulate as much as possible the success of places like the German states and the Netherlands and whatnot. So I don't think there's a mindset. What you do see, as I said, the immigration coming in from Central Asia, and I think what the basic idea is that use the Central Asians for menial labor, kind of a lower paying jobs, and they'll figure out a way, if possible, to do the higher tech jobs with the Russian population itself. But I don't see them making, except in small numbers. I don't see them inviting. And even when you look in the past, Peter the Great, there was a small European section established in St. Petersburg and in Moscow of foreign workers that were highly technically skilled. But their numbers are so much smaller than the huge numbers that come as farmers under Catherine the Great, all the way up until the 1870s when you have the last big wave from Congress Poland into Volhynia.
So it sounds to me as a sort of general theme, you don't seem at all convinced by the idea that they currently are going to do anything of the sort. So the sort of historical necessity of, a huge skilled population over here with not enough space and resources and this kind of vacuum over here, you're
Well,
kind of like,
I haven't seen them do anything to give great incentives and to support that type of migration. I mean, they issued manifestos that gave special privileges, and then they sent people out to Central Europe to like tout. They literally, go from farm to farm saying, "Look, if you come to this place, we'll give you all of these privileges. Right? You should come. We'll give you free land. We'll give you freedom of religion. We'll give you freedom from conscription. We'll give you freedom from taxation." right? So this is where the pull factor came in from. And this was combined with the fact that after the 7-Year War, there's lots of high taxes, conscription, violation of religious freedom. Lots of people in Central Europe just wanted to escape.
Right. So just for our viewers, you're talking again now about the period of Catherine.
Yeah,
Right.
right. But I don't see that being replicated today.
At least not at present. Okay. And then, so in such a situation, you would expect, I mean, if you can expect anything of Russia, and certainly I'm not particularly knowledgeable about it. I don't speak Russian. I've only been there once and briefly. But you would, I would anyway, imagine that you would, if you're not going to see something like a program of bringing in Europeans to bring in those skills and talents and the rest, specialized abilities and et cetera, then you would expect to see something perhaps a little bit more like what Orban is doing in order to incentivize, rearing, larger numbers of Russians, some sort of program to incentivize having kids and the rest. Have you seen anything of that sort?
No, but it might happen. I can see that. I mean, certainly the Soviet Union had such incentives, so it wouldn't be something that would be totally new. The idea of family payments for families based on the number of children they have. So they could have natalist policies. I know that they've been quite successful with natalist policies in Estonia, which has had them now for quite some time, over a decade, I think.
And it would seem to me that, when you talk about the movements within what used to be the USSR, there's certainly a fair amount of the sort of wringing of that situation in order to get every last sort of drop out of it, in the sense of having the European populations of some of what, like, for example, what we call the stands, come back to the more European or Europeanized areas of Russia. So, for example, I've seen, they have large populations of Europeans in what is now Uzbekistan. I imagine it probably less so for, particularly in places like, what is it, Samarkand? What's the capital?
Tashkent?
Tashkent, yeah, sorry. Yes,
Well, I mean, most of the Russians lived in the big cities, so Tashkent would have been one of the major settlements, but except for Kazakhstan, and even then there's been a big exodus. There's not huge European populations anymore, really. I mean, I think Uzbekistan is now up to 80% Uzbek or something, and part of the non-Uzbek are Tajiks and other Central Asians. So there's been a flood out, but I mean, the biggest flood would have been out of Kazakhstan, and that would have been, several million people, maybe 3 or 4 million at least coming out. I'd have to go look at the numbers.
But it would have been roughly the early 90s with, all the major changes.
In the 90s is when you had the big flood out, and it's also when you had other European groups move out. So a lot of Germans going back to Germany, a lot of Poles going back to Poland, even Greeks going back to Greece.
Well, then it sounds as though, if indeed anything along the lines of what my friend Tim has hypothesized, if anything is going to be happening along those lines, it's not happening now, and we'll have to keep our eyes fixed on the horizon in order to identify perhaps its signs. Again, if indeed any of those sorts of things are going to happen at all. Well, we have a few minutes left here, and I have sort of directed this here and there. I want to give you a little bit of time here at the end to maybe cover things that you didn't have a chance to get out, major ideas that you think our viewers should understand in considering this subject. Anything basically that I've gotten in the way previously of you being able to say.
One thing I wanted to say that I was thinking about is that the mindset of how ethno-racial views in Russia is different than in Europe. So while they are okay, they view the Germans and the Poles and these other Western Europeans, particularly during the Soviet era, as being alien, right, outsiders. And so you have this kind of exclusionary racism against them, right? And the exclusionary racism in Western Europe, historically, you have anti-Semitism, but the idea is you want to expel, or if you can't geographically do that, kill that group. That's why they get forcibly dispersed through Siberia and Kazakhstan, removed from the European part of the USSR during the Second World War after the Nazi invasion. Their attitude towards Central Asians is more like the European view towards colonial people. That is, they have no desire really to cause harm to them, but they just want to use them and exploit them as a cheap labor force, much like the kind of racism that develops colonially. And so in that sense, if they're given the choice, you want to have a bunch of these hard-working aliens that are loyal to a hostile state come in, or do you want to have these menial, cheap-paid people that used to be in your empire that you can just kind of reconstruct the empire on a smaller level? I think they're going to opt for the second option. You can have Russian-speaking, docile Central Asians that are aware of how the Soviet Russian system works and what their place is in it. They'd rather have that as come in than people that would be potentially hostile, potentially able to threaten their status and position.
And would you say that there is any, this is helpful too, I continue to learn. Well, then let me throw one sort of last question at you. It's out of the blue, so whatever your thoughts might be. Is there a difference? Is there any discernible difference in how they handle things, for example, over in the West on the borders with Europe versus in the Far East and the Pacific, right? Because this is a country that has, Pacific ports. Is there anything that we could see there? I mean, because it's just, my friend Tim always gets on me about China, and he's like, look, you have to understand, and India as well. He's like, it's not a nation. Yes, it is a nation, but it has these distinct independent units within it. I'm sure it's not quite the same with Russia. Obviously, the stands are different with this long-standing association with a different region, or autonomous republics or oblasts or whatever, and Caucasians and the rest. But because Russia is so huge, is there anything that we can see in terms of differences of policies or how things are done, or what the future might hold as regards to the West versus the Far East?
Well, I think they still put a lot more emphasis into places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, west of the Urals, than they do in the Far East, although, of course, Vladivostok is still a very important city, as are some of the eastern Siberian cities like Irkutsk and Krasnoyarsk. But one of the things I think is that the 1937-1938 removal of Koreans and Chinese from the Far East has a longer kind of half-life in terms of that I think if there was to be a problem with mass immigration from China, they'd be able to deal with it much easier than, say, dealing with Central Asians in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They could remove them much faster with a lot more popular support.
Yeah, obviously you've got groups of people that are, visibly in terms of their phenotype, they're much more distinct, and it's easy to say, look.
Well, Central Asians are pretty distinct too. I mean, Kyrgyz, they speak Russian, but they don't look like Russians.
Right, absolutely.
But you see in Moscow, you go to the Stolovayas, or they call it 99 ruble coffee. The Kyrgyz seem to dominate those service jobs, which are not very well paid.
Okay. Well, then it seems that there is not that major difference between the, at least in terms of your knowledge, and certainly in terms of mine, there's nothing to really single out or distinguish, East from West. Okay. Well, obviously we're only able to sort of dip our toe into the water. But this is really helpful for me because it helps me to form, a much more informed picture of what's actually going on. That's the advantage of talking to someone who has specialized in these recondite subjects and looked into the details of them for quite some time. So then what I would say is thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. And before we wrap this up, can you tell our viewers again where they can find you and follow you, Twitter, YouTube, and the rest, and provide them with the names or links? Or
Yeah. Jonathan Pohl is my YouTube channel.
And that's Pohl, correct?
Correct, Pohl. Yeah, so very, very common name among various ethnic Germans who went to settle in the East. So, and then Twitter is Otto Pohl 1, and my academic edu site is just Otto Pohl without the first initial. So you can find a variety of my pieces, but I'd say the one that probably most relevant is one I published in 2009 or so in the Journal for Study of Ethnicities and Nationality, I think it's called. But it's called Volk auf dem Weg, Transnational Migration of the Russian Germans from 1763 to present. So it deals with moving into the empire, getting moved around the empire, and then moving out of the empire. But the territory of the empire.
Right. I mean, basically what I'm hearing here is that rather than having had to, put you through my asking all about this, I should have just gotten your damn paper and read it, right? But then my viewers wouldn't have been exposed to your thoughts and content.
Supplementary information.
Indeed. All right. Well, then I hope everyone will check out Otto's work. Dr. Pohl is always interesting to talk to. Again, he knows quite a bit about Kurdistan as well. You can see him discussing some of that over on JF Garepi's live streams. So please consider checking that out as well. This was just, again, dipping of the toes into the water in terms of this subject. I'm going to be watching it much more closely, and perhaps an opportunity will arise in future for me to speak with Dr. Pohl again. Until that happens, I'm Semigok, and I am out.